Well, good afternoon, everyone, and we're delighted to have a guest speaker this afternoon, Professor Alberto Melloni. Professor Melloni is Secretary of FSC IRE, which is the Foundation for Religious Sciences at Bologna. He holds the UNESCO Chair on Religious Pluralism and Peace at Unibo, which is also at Bologna, and the Chair of History of Christianity at Unimore, lots of acronyms, which is the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. He is Dean of the Italian PhD in Religious Studies, Scientific Coordinator of the EU Research Infrastructure, Resilience.org, founder of the European Academy of Religion. He's a General Editor of the Interpretation of Greek and Latin Texts in Corpus Christianorum, and member of many editorial boards of great distinction. Since 2020, he serves as the Chief Scientific Advisor of the European Commission. And Professor Melloni is going to speak to us on higher education and religious studies in Europe, challenges, opportunities, needs for a pluralist society. Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to come to this topic and grateful to the ambassador and to the president for this invitation. My topic concerns a cross-section of a little corner of the process encompassing scientific research, the creation of knowledge and the human-to-human building of an intimate space for this knowledge, namely called higher education. Since its beginning, this complicated process relies on a postulate that is represented by the Latin word universitas, namely a system which considers at the same time and on the same level, one, the need for specialization and the huge to narrow research areas in order to be effective and to avoid redundancy, and secondly, the need for a close relationship among divergent and distant disciplines in order to increase the opportunity for a fertile contact, a fertile dialogue and a fertile conflict between different questions. For centuries, this mechanism called university or higher education was an habilitation to the exercise of power, sacred or secular, and modernity created from such a mechanism the marker of a democratic society where all can or must have access to a higher level of education, offering new opportunities through public resources or private money. Now, this mechanism, we know, we are here for this reason, I think, is under pressure due to two reasons. On one side, the need for more and more specialist knowledge is prevailing. And if we accept the idea of Carlos Moedas that I mentioned this morning, research is the passage from money to knowledge, innovation is the passage from knowledge to money, we find asymmetry between research and innovation. Research, money producing knowledge, can rely on public resources or private resources, but private resources will never make the huge investment necessary to beckon so many people to the door to the higher education. On the other side, innovation, from knowledge to money, can produce direct resources for the private investors, but only indirect money for the state or the political union. Indirect money means either higher future tax revenues or formation of social values that cannot be bought, social cohesion, equality among genders, compassion, and so on. So decision makers may be tempted, and they are actually tempted, to support not a universitas scientiarum in its tentative totality, but the type of research which can be transformed quickly into innovation, even if this would reduce research and innovation capacity in the long run. In order to preserve the unity of research and innovation, the most advanced systems have created an external support that is a buttress able to strengthen the system, denoted by the rather imprecise term infrastructure. Infrastructures have existed ever since the very beginning of our higher system of education. First of all, the first university, the Carawin in Fes, founded by a woman. On the most common as a Greek name, bibliotheca, like the one that we are here, and they are designed to create an instrument that equalize research opportunities among different actors. The most complex system designated infrastructure is the CERN in Geneva, where two aspects of higher education are consciously unbalanced. There, research is extremely narrow, but there is also a visibly stronger firewall separating it from practical, economical exploitation. Nothing coming from CERN become money in the short term. There is a very clear reason for this firewall. There remains the possibility that broader results come to fruition. And in my field, this means protecting minorities from the majorities, the vulnerable from the untouchables, and so on. This preamble can be applied to the topic of my talk, that is, what this has to do with religious studies. And to start, we must say that in the 70s of the past century, Sir John Lennon suggested that we imagine a world without war, violence, hate, and, as he wrote, no religion too. In a couple of decades of that century, the Western history, one may think that Imagine was both a song, a sociological diagnosis, and a political program, performing the pressure of the capitalistic society into the ethical foundation of that time. It was a vision, paradoxically, very well integrated with the most conservative discourse coming from religious authorities, mostly from Roman Catholic hierarchies. The myth of a golden age of Christianity, placed more or less in something called Middle Ages, or more commonly in a place that was dated when I was young, was evoked by conservative bishops and popes. And it was adopted to explain that the loss of the true religion was the cause of every disaster, transforming the corporative communion of the people in a system of individuals who are island condemned to relativism and uncertainty. Such explanation was not only disseminated by vulgar conservative sermons, but it also came up in much more cultivated people. For instance, one is the most recent writing of Pope Benedict XVI, trying to explain the disaster of sex abuse against children as a consequence of 1968 and the sex revolution of the 60s. History came to disappoint the multifaceted simplism of such a vision. Religion existed, it does exist, and its worst uses were adopted by a variety of confessional or denominational hemisphere. Infra-religious violence among Christian confession, infra-religious violence among Muslims denomination, inter-religious violence, and a specific form of terrorism directed against the symbols of the secular society, like Charlie Hebdo or Bataclan. Such phenomenon can be described as a specific variant of what we call the climate change. There is, beside the environmental climate change, a climate change affecting the ecosystem of faith, a change of temperature in religious atmosphere. Historical and also sociological observation confirms that the global temperature of religion is rising, not only in countries where political cynicism has financed and continues to finance militia and armies that fight in the name of God. Religious climate change has defeated the illusion of the mid-20th century sociology and song that saw secularization as an inescapable event, a blessed or cursed product of le magnifiche sorti progressive, the wonderful destiny and progressive named by Giacomo Leopardi. Religious climate change has shown without a new historical ethological way of thinking, the burden of the past would be dangerous for the West, and that the Western democracies were incapable to counter what Gilles Kepel called in his best book, La Revanche de Dieu. This is particularly true ever since the change began at the end of the 70s. Gilles Kepel says that the election of Menachem Begin, Jimmy Carter, Karl Wojtyła, and the revolution of Ruhollah Khomeini started this revenge of God, and started what I call the religious climate change. The religious climate change has accompanied the increase of religious extreme events, which are multiplying across the planet within and among families of faith, most recently among Orthodox in Ukraine. They are fueling the idolatry of violence, and they are creating a tragic form of killing in which victims are not more victims than the other one, but killed for the most stupid reasons, that is religion. Against this, an immense effort has been deployed to contain the religious climate change. It is what is called the effort for interfaith dialogue, intercultural dialogue, multi-religious dialogue, or infra-religious dialogue, and something with infra and multi placed in some part of the sentence. Today, interfaith is a big part of different diplomatic, academic, international agendas, very diverse among themselves, belonging to different genealogies. However, they apparently share the view that historical process can be used only to demonstrate the beauty of an idyllic truism. Peace is a true use of religion, violence is an abuse of religion, and this noble approach is rewarded by public consensus, and it collects the gentle applause of a worldwide audience. Facts say something different. Almost all religious communities have bodies and high officials committed to dialogue and a narrative of dialogue, on which they try to recover from a past made of violence. Almost all academic systems are more and more prepared for the production of some knowledge. They launch specific courses, they open centers in order to train lawyers, diplomats, theologians, education practitioners, and media experts. Almost all international diplomatic actors and multilateral organizations are ready to invest in their own interfaith networks, usually in fight with other interfaith networks, one must say. Institute, office, tables, for alliances, projects, even if the dialogue among them is very scarce, as I said. The counterproof is that the great publishers have recently started to publish companion or handbooks for a market which is growing. Big multilateral bodies have accepted the trend. The UN is parent or part of the Alliance of Civilization and Religion for Peace. UNESCO as a unit twin on multicultural dialogue. The OSCE and G20 summit at an interfaith forum. Indonesia recently at the G20 started at R20 only for religious leaders. No one can undermine the moral value of this process of dialogue between earth and heaven. And it would be wrong to ignore that for some religious leaders there is no cost to giving the standard sermon, usually accompanied by the candles and the Baroque adagio. But for some people, to raise the voice for the rights of a minority, or to enter into a theological encounter or to defend human rights can be very dangerous. It may cost them their lives. A large number of men and women of prayer act, and they do serve actually to delegitimize the perversion of faith, supporting the holy war, disassociating oneself from the believers or co-religionists who kill in God's name is actually a legitimate act of self-defense in face of the malice of those who start by demanding condemnation and who end up saying that it is too little or too late or both. However, the historian must look very carefully into the places and the meaning of the virtual, political, and spiritual milieu of which this defense is part, because the latter has been also the matrix of self-absolution with respect to the weight of the violence. There is, in fact, a marketplace of dialogue in which there is a standard sermon coming to the public speech of a great religious leader, an immaturity in the analysis of this issue that can be represented in a caricature more or less like this. True lions are vegetarians, non-vegetarian lions are not true lions, and the supreme lions, sooner or later, will have his revenge of them. Maybe the true lions in the only non-vegetarian lions, and he will eat non-vegetarian lions. The character is very unfair, but it may suggest that the line is not between vegetarian and carnivores, but between cannibals and non-cannibals. Beyond the metaphor, the historian may see that this is the register that had inspired many speeches, quite a few of which had a less than laudable function, good intention, and some effect. But what we know is that violence is part of religion, and even before René Girard, the history of Cain and Abel told us that this is one of the problems. And the problem is how to curb not the violence in the name of its theological illegitimacy, but because of its reason. The market of dialogue, the candlelight dialogue, the Albinoni Adagio dialogue, is supported by the growing of a good deal of religious illiteracy, which is part, in my view, of the religious climate change. I've tried to explain this in a book that I have edited by Routledge on European religious illiteracy, and I will take only some point of this on this point. The religious illiteracy can be considered neither the premise nor the product of secularization of the public space. Instead, it has to be understood as an historical fact produced by a theologische Unklarheit that encompasses our intellectual landscape. Religious illiteracy is not the pessimistic definition of an indifference to the religious sphere that has lost its serenity, but is the contrary. It is the darkness that envelops indifference and cohabitation. Religious illiteracy is not a dilemma created by the migration of far-off religious universes filtered over the centuries through the eyes of colonialism. It is, on the contrary, what the end of colonialism and uncontrollable migration has helped us to see. It is a condition that can and must be defined in this way: illiteracy, not by a metaphor,
but in fact, they denies the assimilation of different religious landscape to the majoritarian one, and they can produce very great dangers. Like any other form of illiteracy, religious illiteracy or analphabetism is a social evil with a certain origin. On a global scale,
it cannot be explained just by the end of religious influence of the society, but it proceeds, on the contrary, from the rupture of an existential metric system that was typical of the old modernity, the modernity preceding our postmodern society. In such modernité à l'ancienne, there is a sort of individual path, moving individual, in a sort of self-secularization. When you are a kid, you are full of religious feeling. When you are growing, you move away from this. But this rupture between the two moments of the life gives and gave to a great deal of, a great number of people the sense that possess the alphabet or religious experience, even if they are emancipated from it. What happened today is the contrary. The increasingly rapid accumulation of generation who did not migrate from the lens of belief into the lens of secularization creates the problem of what Charles Taylor calls the immanent era. that seems to be a problem not only of a Western generation, but a global issue. In that generation, there are individuals capable of eradicate from themselves traces of spiritual, but many are simply incapable to frame what is the theoretical rupture around them. The concept of religious illiteracy or religious analphabetism discloses the rupture between the self-secularized generation and the native agnostics, which has been reinforced by an equally important rupture within the knowledge and learning pertinent to religious studying, namely the research dealing with the conceptions and experience of people self-defining believers. But it also offers some data concerning the status of disciplines that are now emancipated from ecclesiastical or authoritative control. On one side, there is the research for a neutral knowledge concerning religious experience, and the idea that there is a sort of reverse of the ancient inquisitorial paradigm. In the inquisitorial paradigm, you must be a believer to say something concerning religion. In the neo-inquisitorial idea, the religious experience itself is something preventing from a neutral knowledge of the religious experience. The historical disciplines, as on the contrary, told us that there is a contradiction that affects also religious study. Namely, we have the tendency, as every other science, also in the humanities, to go into more narrow fragments that can give the specialization. But this leaves an awful lot of room to other tentative to reaccumulate a description of the entire picture. And so the idea that you can fight religious illiteracy, finding possible responses to this in an easy system, using enough fragments to say something about the reality that is, on the contrary, much more complex than the fragments may say. So the request of some new solution was very strong in between the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, and it is mostly France, la République très laïque, that offered some interesting responses. One is the famous report of Régis Debray au ministre de l'Éducation nationale, written for Jacques Lang in April 2002, concerning the teaching of the religious facts in the secular school. It is the proposal reinforcing humanities without confusion between, it is interesting the language, between the two magisteria, the magisteria of the humanities and the magisteria of the church. Diane Moore offered a different approach, namely the idea that there is a way to restart a process of religious literacy, starting from the secondary school, in which the family, she said, has a paramount role in the upbringing of children, including in the choice of a religious upbringing. The third is the report of Bernard Stasi, Laïcité et République, made for the presidency of the Republic, that says that religious diversity would be the only one among all the other diversity present in educational system to be carried out not for knowledge of the subject, but in terms of comparison. And later, in 2007, the so-called principle of Toledo offered some solution concerning teaching about religions and guiding principles concerning teaching about religion. The idea is that some knowledge of religion in comparative terms, like in the Stasi report, there is the root of a better citizenship. What we try to do at the European level as a foundation with a group of 12 universities is, on the contrary, to start something different, beginning not in the school but from the higher education. Namely, to build up a research infrastructure that has been approved by the European Strategic Forum of Research Infrastructure, ESFRI, offering new opportunities and new opportunities for scholars. My sense, my idea, my proposal is that the idea that you can start from the school treating analphabetism is not proper, because when you had to fight the ordinary analphabetism of the uncultivated society, you had already prepared the people that were capable to teach this and to create the love for literature, the taste for reading books or writing books and poetry. On the contrary, here we are in a situation very different, in a situation of tragic scarcity of specialists that are capable to understand and define what is the complexity of a pluralistic society. If the story of Cain and Abel is true, and I guess that is very true, in front of the altar there is not only fraternity, but also fratricide. And the knowledge is the only way to prevent fratricide, except having at disposal Sigmund Freud, that unfortunately in the Garden of Eden was not available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Melloni, for that fascinating presentation. I think we have time for a couple of questions, if there are any from the floor. Dan?
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful tour de force, but also generosity of spirit. My question is about the proposition of the, how do I put it, particularly in an American context, the merger of religious participation in politics on the right, and the implications that religion therefore is a preserve of a particular political persuasion. Certainly it's distorting in American context because it means we've lost the kind of social mission version of Christianity, which is very important in the civil rights movement, just to take one example. But I wonder what effect it has on the story that you're telling about how we absorb religious tradition and how we introduce it as part of people's education, if it's already been appropriated in some sense, if I can put it that way. Thank you.
You want to come here?
Well, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, the connection between religious experience and extreme right is not at all an American problem. We have some problem, Houston, also in Italy. From my point of view, the real point is the chronological limits that you can adopt. I am very fond with this metaphor of the religious climate change, because nobody thinks that you can solve the issue of climate change next morning, or next Tuesday, or next month, or next year. You can have targets that are going to 2050, and we don't know if they are realistic enough, brave enough, or not brave enough, but we know that it's a long-term issue. So we come to the end of the John Lennon era, in which everybody was thinking that religion was ready to disappear quietly from the horizon, and only the despair of some grandmother looking to the grandchildren or going to the mass, not even on Christmas, will be the only consequence of this. On the contrary, we have seen that decrease of religious practice has not created great benefits for religious practice. On the contrary, has made it more vulnerable to conservative or reactionary dreams, and created the idea that religions are there not to teach virtues, but to defend values. That is, in my view, the shift between the two things. Because if you teach virtue, the way in which I may use this virtue, you may use this virtue, could be different. They remain virtues. But if they are values, they become non-negotiable values. They become splitting society values, and so on. And so, from my point of view, the idea of rebuilding a large audience of scholarship that is not based on the idea that the best knowledge of religion is a comparative one, neutralizing the fact that there are strong beliefs inside it. But on the contrary, taking into account hermeneutics, that is the real patrimony, is a strong one. There is a friend of mine, Professor Fernanda Alfieri, remember this name, that I told it to somebody, discovered gay marriage in the 15th century in Venice. A very nice story, because being the marriage in the 15th century, a marriage only by the consent of the people without any authority, the only rule was to say words at the present. So I love you is a marriage. I will love you, it's a problem. So be careful. If you get back to the 15th century, remember this. The ecclesiastical tribunal are full of pregnant women asking for the marriage. And the judge says, how did he tell you? And there is a wonderful sentence in which she says, he told me I will love you. And the judge says, oh, poor. Beside this, there was a little number of cases, very interesting, of same-sex marriages, in which at the death of one of the two, the other one is going to the tribunal for the heritage. The family of the dead one says, come on, they are two women. How they can have a marriage? And there are sentences in favor of the family and sentences in favor of the widower. Because the judge says, everybody knew that they were two women. What's the problem? It was the pre-sacramental definition of marriages that were very useful from this point of view. I'm very aware that this will not change the discussion concerning same-sex marriage today. It will, but at least it will say that in the darkness of fundamentalism, a little flame could be enough to say that there is not only darkness.
Any other questions? Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Melloni, for your contribution. My name is Nalako Fanila, and my doctorate is on designing the interdisciplinary language between physics and philosophy for visionary thought. What I wanted to ask you about is, what is UNESCO's intentions in terms of pluralism and peace?
Well, the name of the chair has been invented by me. There is nothing official in the UNESCO, no UNESCO definition supporting the definition. So the intention that I had in this area is to say that the pluralistic society needs a greater quantity of higher education. This is my point. This is the song that I can sing everywhere with different hats on my head. And I think that the destiny of pluralistic society is to live in peace or to live divided. And so for me, peace is another way to say not divided. What we see, for instance, in very cultivated society is, I was mentioning the US. We see that pluralistic society can create great divide, and to split a society. And to divide a society is very easy. To rebuild the social cohesion is very complicated, and can create mismatch that can be very dangerous in this terms. And so my sense is this is the first sense that I have. The second reason is a postulate that I may confess. I think that what make religious experience violent is not a more intense attitude, but a weakness and a fear. I have a personal museum of epic failure. One is concerning, I mentioned it this morning, the tentative to substitute impact with fertility. A disaster. Impact has destroyed any chance of fertility to become a measure. The other epic fail that I had was a tentative made very consistently in the European Union to avoid this idea to call the Islamist terrorism radical. Because radical is a noble word. And to give this word to people killing other one is a big mistake. If you go to the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and you ask, Holy Father, are you a radical Christian or a moderate one? He will probably say, I try to be a radical Christian, of course, but it's not killing anybody. And so the thing in which a cultivated experience of scientific research in religious studies could be also a way to avoid this type of mistakes, which consequences could be very long.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Melloni. We've been enriched by your presence here today, and thank you very much for giving your time to us. Thank you. We now move to a panel discussion on global perspectives in higher education, challenges to academic freedom and trust in scientific endeavour. And the moderator is Professor Karl Leydecker, Senior Vice Principal at the University of Aberdeen, also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And Karl actually was a very active member of our higher education task force. And he's joined by Sinéad O'Gorman, from European Director, Scholars at Risk, and Luke Drury, the Vice President of ALLEA, former President of the Academy, and Professor Linda Hogan of Trinity College, Dublin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honour to be invited to participate in this conference. When we set out the Higher Education Futures Task Force work, one of the things that we did was, as we heard this morning, is set out a values-based vision. And one of those 10 core values was a commitment to academic freedom and research integrity. And that's why we're exploring that topic today. And our initial focus for this is going to be on global perspectives. And so I'm going to dispense with lengthy introductions of my fellow panelists in the interest of time, but I thought what we would do is we would have a couple of minutes reflections from each of our panelists to start with, and then we'll hope to get into a relatively relaxed, free-flowing dialogue across the panel. So there's our challenge. But I wondered if, in terms of setting that scene of a global perspective, I might turn Sinéad to you. Sinéad, to you first. You are, of course, the Director of Scholars at Risk European Office, based here in Ireland at Maynooth. And you have been reflecting on this in the work that you do in the organisation. So I wonder if we could hear from you, first of all, to set the scene.
Thanks very much, Karl. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join the panel, and my thanks to the Royal Irish Academy for organising today's event. So as Karl mentioned, I'm here today as a practitioner rather than as an academic. I direct Scholars at Risk Europe, which is based at Maynooth University, and all of our work on the topic of academic freedom is grounded in our direct assistance of over 2,000 scholars from more than 100 countries over 20 years. And so in these opening words, I wanted to very briefly summarize the findings of our most recent report, which is called the Free to Think report. And every year for the past 10 years, we've been monitoring 6 types of attacks on higher education communities around the world. And these include violence, killings and disappearances, wrongful imprisonments, wrongful prosecutions, restrictions on travel, loss of position, and other severe or systemic issues. And this year's report covers 391 attacks in 65 countries and territories. And this is actually the highest registered number in the history of these reports. And of course, we know that this figure only represents the tip of the iceberg. Many, many incidents are going unreported, whether due to self-censorship or media restrictions in given countries, or simply due to lack of resources for further monitoring. And similarly, we see very concerning findings from the Academic Freedom Index, which many of you might be familiar with. It's published by the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, and Scholars at Risk is an advocacy partner on that index. It's a global data set with contributions from almost 2,000 country experts, and it covers 177 countries and territories. And their most recent annual data also shows substantial declines in respect for academic freedom since 2011, affecting almost 1/3 of the world's population. So taken together, the available evidence demonstrates that we have a very significant problem. Academic freedom is on a downward trajectory in most parts of the world, and attacks on scholars are on the rise. If I might just say give a few examples from these reports. So at Scholars at Risk, we've always looked at threats to academic freedom and to scholars as existing along a continuum, from very subtle threats like self-censorship or harassment, right through to the very severe threats as reported in our Free to Think report, including violence, killings and disappearance, whether they are perpetrated by state or a variety of non-state actors. And to give some examples, on the more severe end of the spectrum, we reported on threats to scholars in Afghanistan, for example, the recent killing of a law professor by the Taliban for his anti-extremist interpretations of religious texts. We reported on the arrest and prosecution of scholars in Myanmar following the February 2021 coup in that country, on the targeted destruction and in some cases occupation by Russia of higher education institutions in Ukraine, and indeed the persecution and flight of many scholars from Russia. And SAR has received over 200 applications from Russia since February. Then on the more moderate end of the spectrum, but still very serious, we reported on developments in the United States, where state legislatures around the country proposed bills aimed at restricting the teaching of so-called divisive concepts, often meaning race, gender, and sexuality. And in Hong Kong, we reported on pressures to conform curricula to the national security law that Beijing imposed in 2020, with public universities now requiring students to attend national security courses. And then, of course, not included in the Free to Think report, but also very worrying, are threats on the more subtle end of the spectrum, which are more difficult but not impossible to measure, including a gradual erosion of respect for expertise, anti-intellectualism, and structural pressures relating to the marketization of higher education. But despite all of these challenges, however, what really brings us hope is that this issue is in the spotlight in policymaking circles, both on the national and European and international level. So this brings unprecedented numbers of opportunities for us all to work together to respond. So I hope later in the discussion we can maybe address some of those. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinéad, for setting out that very worrying perspective. And I wondered if we could turn, Luke, to you next. Luke Drury, of course, I think needs no introduction here at all, really, but a past president of the RIA, and of course, potentially, most importantly in this conversation, vice president of ALLEA. So can I turn to you?
Thank you very much for that introduction. I would like to start just by making it clear that I'm talking today in a personal capacity. But of course, I do also represent ALLEA, the Federation of European Academies. And at ALLEA, we take a very deep interest in these issues, which reflect on core European values. In April 2019, together with the European Universities Association, I don't know if Professor Murphy is still here, but thank you, and Science Europe, representing the major national funding agencies, we issued a joint statement on academic freedom and institutional autonomy, which called on governments and public authorities to, and I quote, protect academic freedom and safeguard institutional autonomy by providing sound regulatory frameworks and refraining from interference in the internal affairs of higher education and research institutions. Now, I'm afraid that has largely fallen on deaf ears. In June 2021, together with Scholars at Risk Ireland, so thank you, we co-organized an online conference on academic freedom and intellectual dissent, which included an address by An Tuachtaráin Michael D. Higgins, as well as a keynote by Noam Chomsky. The recording is available on the ALLEA website, YouTube channel, if you want to see it. Most recently, in September of this year, in a lengthy statement on the European Research Area Policy Agenda, we particularly welcomed the commitments to academic freedom embodied in Policy Action 6. All of these documents and more can be found on the ALLEA website. Now, my personal interests at the moment are mainly in the areas of open science, reform of research assessment, which we discussed earlier, and the future of scholarly communication. But these areas all intersect with institutional autonomy, academic freedom, and issues of trust. And if I can perhaps pick up from 2 points from Professor Melloni's interesting talk, it does seem to me that many of the problems we face in the global north are due to our excessive individualism. We focus very much on individual rights, on individual freedoms. But in reality, scholarship is a communal activity. Science is a global public good. It's created by communities, by epistemic peer communities. And when we talk about defending academic freedom, we're actually talking about defending the systems and communities which generate reliable knowledge. And that leads me to my second point. You made the interesting comment about religious illiteracy. We also have a big problem with research illiteracy. You see very many contrarians saying, go and do your own research, by which they mean search on Google until you find something that agrees with me. This is not research, folks. And one of our problems, I think, is we have to convey to the broader civic society and public community what actually serious scholarly research is. It's not easy. It involves peer review. It involves critical assessment by your epistemic peers. And if somehow we have to get that message across. So I think I've said enough for that. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I'm going to turn now to Linda Hogan, who is Professor of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin and a former Deputy President of that esteemed institution. So could you offer a perspective, please?
Thank you very much. And thank you also to the Academy for the invitation to be part of this panel. I thought I would spend just a few moments really thinking about the essential connection between academic freedom and trust in scientific endeavour as the two sort of themes of our panel. So fake news, weaponized lies, alternative facts. This language we know is commonplace, and now particularly in relation to climate change, COVID-19, the politics of immigration. And not only are the claims and conclusions on these matters subject to intense debate, but they're also occasions of dispute about the trustworthiness of science, Wissenschaft, whether that be biomedical and natural sciences, or, for example, in relation to social scientific analyses and historical contextualizations of trends in migration. All of these are contested. Of course, science denial is not new, but in this global context of political polarization and a very permissive regime of regulation of social media, I think the stakes are perhaps higher than ever before. And I think one can possibly argue that trust in science has become a new frontier in the struggle against multiple interrelated challenges, whether they're geopolitical, technological, ecological, cultural, and socio-economic. And although these challenges frequently function to undermine trust in science, nonetheless, science is also a vital resource, one might even say the only resource, to help us understand the nature and scale of these challenges, and also to develop the knowledge and tools to address them. So trust in science depends on the expertise, the integrity, and the benevolence of scientific endeavor. And academic freedom is a core and non-negotiable value in relation to each of the expertise, the integrity, and the benevolence of science. And as has been said already, is expressed in the rights and responsibilities of individuals, but also the autonomy and accountability of institutions. The expertise of science can't be guaranteed without academic freedom, we know that, including the freedom to challenge the accepted consensus of disciplines. And I do think today the scale of new data sets, the globalization of research questions, globalization of research methods, inter and transdisciplinary approaches to knowledge, each can challenge the settled consensus and problematize accepted norms of our disciplines. So academic freedom, I think in this sense, can be a challenge also for academics in terms of attending to our own normative biases and our habituation in the norms of our respective disciplines. The integrity of science can't be guaranteed without academic freedom. The principles of research integrity, reliability, honesty, transparency, accountability, each requires freedom from duress, whether it's political, ideological, reputational, or financial. And of course, trust in the institution of science depends also on the trustworthiness of among scientists, and that also depends on competency and honesty among colleagues, all of which requires academic freedom. And then just finally, on the benevolence of science, I think that neither can that be guaranteed without academic freedom. The benevolent purpose is to advance knowledge for the benefit of humankind, not for personal advancement. And the creation of knowledge that is consequential for people's well-being also requires academic freedom. So I would agree with Luke's characterization of academic freedom and trust in science as a public good. I'm elaborating slightly here. But it is a public good that must be protected, and also it must be earned. And I think the key to its being earned is by protecting academic freedom in terms of the expertise of science, the integrity of science, and also the benevolence of science. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And reflecting on this panel, and Luke, you mentioned that you published a statement around this. ALLEA had published a statement. I see that the Royal Irish Academy has very recently, just in the last couple of weeks, published a statement on the principles of academic freedom. I noticed the Royal Society of Edinburgh, we have done that as well, and so has the Royal Society of London. Does that indicate that the meaning of academic freedom is still to be discussed and agreed, or is that simply a response to the proliferation of threats to academic freedom? In other words, is academic freedom itself something that we need to debate as to what its meaning is, as opposed to assuming that we know it, and therefore it's simply something to be protected?
I think it's both. I mean, the ALLEA statements, the proximate cause was actually the action of the Orban government in Hungary in expelling the Central European University and effectively banning any discussion of gender research which is an egregious example of interference for ideological reasons in bona fide academic research. It has to be said that there are other instances nearer to home which one could mention, but I won't. I think we all know them. So yes, there is a growing threat. I do think also academic freedom is a difficult concept, and as academics, I think it is our duty to analyze carefully what we actually mean when we talk about academic freedom and be sure that we know what we're talking about. Let me give an extreme example. I mean, academic freedom does not allow a historian to deny the reality of the Holocaust, for example. You have to be doing recognized, valid research according to accepted disciplinary norms to appeal to academic freedom. And I think we need to be very clear on that. I do think also that there is an important intersection with trust. Research surveys actually, well, the Trustometer survey actually shows that scientists are, on the whole, trusted. It's in specific areas where politicians, for their own ends, have tried to drive wedge issues, climate change being one, COVID being another, that we see this problem. But in general, if you ask the man in the street if he trusts a geologist to be able to date a rock, well, unless he's a young earth creationist, or she, they will agree with you that they trust them. And on the whole, we trust academic research because we think it's not being influenced by hidden agendas. The corrosive element is if we suspect that somebody is manipulating what research is being done for their own ends. So that, I think the others may wish to comment. I've said enough, I think, on that. Yeah.
Maybe just to say briefly, I think as a community of advocates, we've categorized the challenges that we face as definitional challenges, data challenges, and implementation. And I think at Scholars at Risk, at least, the definitional challenge is the least of our problems at the moment. So we're very focused on the question of more data, more monitoring of attacks, more monitoring of situations where academic freedom is repressed, and then also, and in particular, the question of how do we implement these excellent statements that are in place at so many institutions of higher education. As Michael Murphy pointed to earlier today, a lot of institutions do have statements of academic freedom and values on their web pages. I think much fewer have an ombudsperson, let's say, or a faculty senate or a committee to implement the meaning of these statements, and fewer still would have implementation guidelines as to how do we develop, a policy that on inviting controversial speakers to campus, for example. So for us, the emphasis is elsewhere, even though we recognize, of course, that it's important to agree and have a consensus on a definition.
Thank you. Just to add to those comments, I do think that the threats to academic freedom are increasing, and they are increasing for a variety of reasons, and for the geopolitical, political, cultural, and I think also socioeconomic issues. There is a significant acceleration of in the growth of inequality between nations and within nations, and so I think that too is a factor in the distrust in science and the distrust in experts and the association of experts with privilege, etc. So I think that there is a factor there as well, and I think when that is expressed in media like social media, where there is a real challenge in terms of content moderation and accuracy, I think that really just exacerbates the issue. So I think these multiple intersecting threats really do have an accelerating effect on the issue of academic freedom. I think on the definitional question, I think absolutely the broad parameters are clear. But I do think that the context changes, and I think as our understanding of our disciplines evolve and change, and as disciplines are shaped by intersections with other fields, then that can become, those contestations can either become acceptable as part of a framework for debate about academic freedom, or sometimes they can be shut down. So I do think that although the broad parameters are clear, I think there are emerging issues that mean that we constantly have to rethink whether our functional concept of academic freedom continues to be fit for purpose and adequately responsive.
And I wonder if that's why academic freedom is often linked with something else. Here on our panel, we've linked it with research integrity, but often it's linked with freedom of speech, or it's linked with institutional autonomy. So you often get a framing of it in multiple different ways that I think probably does reflect the different pressures that different education systems are under. I guess if we're all agreed that academic freedom is coming under increasing threat, one of our thoughts should be how should universities, how should the academy respond to those threats? Both, I guess, there's a global perspective to that. So what should universities in Ireland or across the European Union look to do to support our colleagues elsewhere in the world? And then also what might we need to do within our own system, whether it's the Scottish, the UK, the Irish system, the wider European system? What are the key things that are at stake in order to protect academic freedom? Who would like to pick that one up first?
Well, as I think was clear earlier today, there is a certain tension between institutional autonomy and institutional accountability. And that's not going to go away. That's a delicate balance. And I think, from ALLEA's point of view, we would like it to be made very clear, ideally in law, that inappropriate interference with academic research is simply not on. Now, there are some areas where it is legitimate for the state to say that some research can, vivisection, for example. There are experiments which people might like to do, but which for good reasons the state says you can't do them. That is legitimate. That is not an interference with academic freedom. But if you start saying that you can only study certain subjects, or you can only teach certain subjects in ways that conform to political ideology, or religious dogma, or economic interests, then that is wrong. And we need to be very clear about that. Now, who can enforce that? ALLEA and organizations, we can make statements until the cows come home, but unless they're implemented by bodies with power, it's not going to happen. So fundamentally, it has to be either policies enacted by funding organizations. We have seen that funding bodies can actually have significant power over research policy. We saw that, okay, you can argue about whether Plan S was good or bad, but it certainly shook up the system, and it was enforced because funding agencies said they wanted it. Similarly, governments, through law and funding of universities, have a major role to play. And, I'm not going to get into a debate about the Higher Education Authority bill, but there are issues here, and we need to make very clear that the value of independent research conducted mainly in the universities, but not exclusively in the universities. There are citizen scientists doing good research. There are pure research institutes carrying out excellent frontier research. The value of that to society depends to a large extent on the ability of scholars and scientists to decide for themselves what is really interesting and what they want to work on. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you can just go and do anything you want, but you should be at least allowed to make the case that it would be interesting to do this work. That's my position, anyway.
I might add a few points that I think some relate, Luke, to the points you've made. And you might remember that President Michael D. Higgins at that ALLEA event that you mentioned earlier, during his remarks, he recommended that every Irish university introduce a module to teach undergraduate students a course on academic freedom. And so we would expand that recommendation and say that every staff member, every faculty member, in the same way that you have, cybersecurity as part of your orientation for new staff, maybe consider including a small course on academic freedom. So we really supported that idea that was presented. And I know that University College Cork has taken him up on that, and there is a module on academic freedom that was implemented last January. I think another point that some universities in the UK have developed, together with the all-party parliamentary group, have developed a model code of conduct for academic freedom and in the context of internationalization. So, and that could also perhaps serve as a module. Perhaps there is, I'm not certain if there is ongoing work in Ireland in that area. To really act as a touchstone for institutions in their decisions around entering into international partnerships. And then I think in regard to what universities can do within those international partnerships is to, move away from a kind of binary approach where you're deciding either to enter into a partnership or not enter into a partnership, but do so with our values intact and include academic freedom in memorandum of understanding, for example, include those types of provisions so that they are regularly discussed as part of the project. One final point, if I may, on the funding bodies, as you mentioned, I believe for the first time last year or this year, there is a recital in the rules of participation for Horizon Europe and Erasmus+, encouraging the funds to be used, or that academic freedom must be promoted in the countries of the program. And so I think that the greater reference needs to be made to that language as we go about our project implementations.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have much more to add to those very comprehensive points, but just a couple of addenda, I suppose. The first is in relation to the idea and the proposal that universities are places where students and staff routinely discuss academic freedom. I do think that's vital, and I think I would add that in the context of the purpose of the university and the role of the university in wider society and the trustworthiness of science. Seems to me that very often we have discussions about academic freedom as a good in very abstract terms without really connecting it to the reasons why academic freedom is a good and a public good and a global public good. So it's, I think those connections need to be made, maybe not for staff, but certainly for students and certainly for the wider public. That the other thing I would say is that I think also in the context of, teaching, research integrity, training, etc., curricula are so overburdened and crammed nowadays that I think one of the biggest challenges is also to really try and claim that space, or universities to make that space in curricula for these discussions, because very often these debates arise in the context of a controversial speaker or a student who objects to a particular reading or a lecture in a module. And so when these issues arise in very particular circumstances, very often the possibility and opportunities for proper civil, respectful discussion and debate about these what are often blurry lines can't happen. So I think these are the kinds of things that universities absolutely can do because they are within our own control. And there are many other things on which we depend on partner institutions like funding bodies, etc. But there are a lot of things I think universities can do as part of their educational mission as well as their research mission.
So there's a responsibility, I guess, for the individual to train themselves, to be involved in those debates, to exercise academic integrity and so on, research integrity, responsibilities of institutions within the sector, and then, of course, the responsibilities of wider society, and particularly funders, in order to ensure that this is a joined-up effort to protect academic freedom. I'm conscious of time, and I just wonder, Luke, I know you wanted to come in, but one last thought, and then we'll open it up for a question or two.
Just very briefly, and it touches on this communication of values and the point Michael Murphy was making earlier. There's a very interesting experiment in France where doctoral students now at graduation swear an oath that the principles of research integrity which they have been taught, they will apply in their subsequent careers. That's a very interesting idea.
Yeah, I've always been impressed with medical students and the oath they swear, and extending that to all graduates would be not a bad idea, actually. Not a bad idea. Colleagues, are there any thoughts, questions, comments? I think we've got a front here. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. I'm Dr. Andrew Allen. I'm the Vice Chair of the Irish Research Staff Association. I'd just like to raise the point of career precarity as a threat to academic freedom. So increasingly, research staff in this country and internationally are employed on kind of, 2-year contract after 2-year contract, and you can end up spending a decade where like half of your time is spent on probation, where you can be dismissed from your job. It's not that difficult to dismiss someone from their job, and it's true of kind of teaching staff as well, I should say, of course, as well. Where there are these kind of long periods of precarity where even if in terms of how someone interprets qualitative research, to take one example, there'll be a sort of chilling effect in terms of how they might want to interpret or present their results. So I just wonder what the panel would like to say on that. Thanks.
I think you're absolutely right. That's one of the things I was keen that we included some reference to in our report. Particularly around research culture, and some of the work that actually is going on in the UK has been quite helpful in that. I think if we don't get research culture right and issues around precarity and so forth, then I think academic freedom is at risk for those scholars. So, but others, does anyone else want to comment on that?
Well, I would absolutely agree. Tenure is and security is really the basis on which people in practice feel free to exercise academic freedom. So I think it's an absolute, it's a core element. And you're absolutely right. This has been continuously eroded over the last 20 years. And so I think it is having a highly problematic impact on early career researchers. And just by way of example, I've been involved in a Horizon 2020 research project on research integrity. And in that, we surveyed, as part of it, we surveyed about 1,500 PhD students and early career researchers, asking them to identify some of the issues with which they were concerned. And almost 1/3 of them said that they had allocated joint authorship to a person in power because they were either fearful not to do it or they were recommended to do that by another person in power. And the paper will be published soon. But that's just an example of the way in which, that's a PhD students, but the way in which precarity can actually really damage academic freedom and also research integrity. So I do believe it is a very serious problem we have.
Linda has made the point I was going to make.
Yeah, which ultimately comes down to the funding model, which impacts on the precarity. So you want to grab the microphone?
Sorry. The distinction that needs to be assigned is that precarity allowed the interface between the public domain, professionalization of research, and researchers' engagement. So doctoral research, it would be inappropriate, I would agree with you. But if the papers are commissioned, they're commissioned by the person who has mapped out the cartography. It could do with very big themes, very, very big international joint research project themes that are already committed. And therefore, the commissioned paper carries the idea, and the person who carries out the action-based or applied context. And they wouldn't necessarily have the same level of research expertise, knowledge, to support the idea development that the joint research program and the team behind it would have. I just thought I'd make that distinction.
So I think colleague in front, and then we'll need to wrap the session up so we're not eating into the next one.
Sure, very quickly. Sinéad, Luke mentioned the need to avoid echo chambers on the internet, which is very, very apt. But that raises the next question of about artificial intelligence. So I guess most of us in this room will probably have at least one story about how you were talking about a topic and suddenly your phone is showing you adverts or news articles or videos related to that topic that you never searched for. Now, this is obviously targeted, and the phone listen to you no matter how much they say that it isn't. But now, so how do you recognize the risk? Because there is a risk posed by these targeted manipulation, which is essentially capitalist-induced content consumption that would affect scholars. I mean, it would certainly infect, it forms the ground of manipulation in some way.
Well, this is a very big issue. And I mean, I can say that I've deleted my Twitter account. I think one issue is actually the growing use of Google Scholar and services like that as discovery agents in academia. And we really don't know what motivations or what algorithms are being used behind that. So, I mean, it's very convenient. I use it myself all the time, but we need to be a little bit wary. I think you're right to raise this issue. And there's no doubt that the social media platforms, while they have a lot of benefits, also come with great dangers. And one of the dangers is to trust and the integrity of the scientific process. Yeah.
It's a good question. I think it's not the kind of threat that is reported to scholars at risk on a daily basis. It would more arise in the context of online threats coming from non-state actors, but not for the motivations that you describe. And I think also just cybersecurity related questions are basically the same kinds of threats, but coming in online format. So I don't think in the particular guise that you've described, it's something that we've yet dealt with.
It's not really a physical risk, but it is a risk of ideology, I suppose.
Well, it can translate into a physical risk. I mean, we've seen cases of scholars and, well, particularly medical experts being attacked because of the opinions they've expressed on social media. Yeah.
Colleagues, I suspect we could debate these issues for the rest of the day and the whole weekend as well, but it remains only at this stage for me to ask you to join me in thanking our panel, Luke, Sinead and Linda, for their excellent discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent discussion. And I think rather like the one that's coming up, it represents a race with no finishing line. We have to be eternally vigilant in this regard. Our final panel discussion, last but by no means least, is Going Green, Climate Change Mitigation, Adaptation, Sustainability, and Higher Education Efforts to Combat Environmental Disruption. And it's being chaired by Jennifer McElwain from Trinity College Dublin. Jennifer is a former chair of the Climate Change and Environmental Sciences Multidisciplinary Committee at the Academy. And I'll let Jennifer introduce the panel members because I think they may have changed a little since the program was published this morning. So over to you, Jennifer.
Hello? Oh yeah, you can hear me. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for being here at the end of the day. So we have a long title for our panel discussion. To give you an introduction, and then I'm going to introduce our panelists. How can the world go green? Become more sustainable? In the rain shadow, or the shadow of COP27 in Egypt, where world leaders discuss climate action and loss and damages, and in advance of the upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference in Canada, COP15, which gets a lot less press than the climate COP, but it's no less important. So the COP15 will discuss, will agree global goals and actions to halt biodiversity loss and restore nature. What roles can the higher education sector play? And I suppose we could argue that academics and researchers in the higher education sector have already played a pivotal role in documenting the scientific base of climate change and also biodiversity loss. All of our research from Ireland across the globe has fed into intergovernmental reports like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change, and also IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I suppose academics are innovating new green energy technologies, teaching classes on the psychology of climate change, politics of climate change, psychology of the climate crisis, sustainable finance, climate justice, just to name just a few. But I suppose the question we want to address in the panel today is have we done enough? Has the higher education sector played a leading role? We've led in the science of climate and biodiversity research, but have we led in terms of behavioural change and in actually changing our building infrastructure to become zero carbon, or to have our current carbon emissions, to enhance our campuses with rich biodiversity? So on the panel today, we have 3 experts who all are going to share their views on going green and higher education efforts to combat environmental disruption. So I'm delighted to invite my panel members. I'm particularly delighted to invite Professor Jane Stout, who stood in from this morning. She was asked to join the panel, and she basically changed her whole schedule this afternoon to join us. So I'll introduce Jane first. She's a professor of entomology and pollination biology at Trinity College. She is the vice president for biodiversity and climate action. And she's an internationally renowned expert on pollinators and pollination ecology, and a prominent voice for biodiversity and its values. I'm also delighted to welcome Karen Kerr. Dr. Karen Kerr is a lecturer in education in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University Belfast. She's a qualified science teacher and taught in nursery, primary and secondary school in Northern Ireland, England and Spain. Her research background is in science education, in particular outdoor learning, environmental education and education for sustainable development. She has a lot of research experience also in citizen science approaches in the higher education sector. So welcome, Karen. And then finally, Dr. Dermot Torney. Dermot is an associate professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University and holds an MPhil and DPhil in international relations from the University of Oxford. He is a current lead author on a report commissioned by the EPA on which is going to be Ireland's first climate assessment report, and Dermot is going to author the transformational change chapter, probably one of the most, or volume, probably one of the most challenging and also rewarding. And Dermot has also been involved in ALLEA reports on this particular issue, going green and transforming the higher education sector. So I would like to, our plan for the panel today is my panelists are going to give their brief thoughts on this really complex, or what we'd call a wicked topic. We're then going to try and have as dynamic a panel discussion as our previous panel did so well. And then we're going to open it up to the audience for any questions or comments that you would like to make. So I'm going to invite Karen, if you'd like to start us off.
Hi, afternoon, everyone, and thanks for staying behind to the last shift. I just want to thank the Academy for the invite. Really happy to be here, particularly coming down from Belfast, but I have to get it in, you know, as a Derry girl, I'm really happy to be here as well. Never leaves you no matter where you live. And obviously I was very interested in all of the speakers so far today as that generation of people who left school the year that the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I consider myself very lucky and very privileged to be living in our Ireland of today. I think we've all come a long way, but I think we've got a long way to go. Not least of all with this hugely wicked problem that we've got. So I guess my background is very much so in the literal sandpit with preschool and early primary aged children, looking at science and the world around us and nature and all of those wonderful things that children very naturally philosophize about and think about and wonder about. I just wish that we could keep that. So one of my missions as an educationalist is to try to keep that in our young people right the way through university and into their working lives. In terms of higher education and what we're at and where we're going and are we doing enough? Have we done enough? I think we probably have a way to go, but I do think that there's some wonderful grassroots work that is happening, just in my own institution, but in other institutions too. I think the key thing is, somebody mentioned that awful term, ivory tower. I don't see university like that anymore now as, a child that was brought up on a council estate and lots of social mobility and a new Northern Ireland, I guess. So, Thankfully, the landscape of our university has changed significantly in terms of all types of diversity. But I still think we do have a little bit of a way to go there, right across both inside the university and externally, right from our leadership to our academic staff, non-academic staff, our students, their families, and the other agencies that we work with. And I'm reluctant to use external agencies because we're all on this planet. We're all on this island. We're all on this planet. Nobody's actually external to what's going on. So I don't see the people that I work with out that, their desk might not be in my university, but we're all in it together. And that work that goes on with the likes of our Education for Sustainable Development Forum. I'm also a trustee and board member for the Northern Ireland Environment Link. And, we quite naturally work together in the protection of our beautiful landscape and our world. I think the university has naturally, by its setup and just the fact that, communities grow around it oftentimes, and, our university is a big employer in each of our areas. We have reach, but we have ripple as well. And I think that we don't often focus on that. So, we're working on all sorts of things from sustainable food, sustainable engineering, philosophy, how philosophy counteracts with science, different literacies. I myself have responsibility for training all future post-primary science teachers, which is a pretty big responsibility that I take very seriously. So we have huge reach, we have a huge potential, but I think that it's necessary that we're all working together. And I picked up from today, and had already noted this on the way down on the train, the importance of that connection with ourselves, connection with nature, and connection with others. I think that's the way forward, and I think as a university we can most certainly model that. In terms then back to the sandpit, back to preschool. Way back when, it wasn't that long ago. It is very recent history where we were educating children in rows for industrialization. So if we can educate and train people for industrialization, then we can definitely train and power for decarbonization. History shows us that we are capable of so much. when we put our heads together. And we were, we look at what industrialization did, I guess, at the time. Now we're maybe having to undo some of that. But I think with all heads together, we can most certainly do it right across our communities, right across our island, and with our friends, global north and south as well. So, and I guess that mission will continue.
Thank you, Karen. That's wonderful and optimistic. And I love the idea of connections and maybe deindustrialization in terms of carbon. It's great ideas. So, Jane, if you could add your reflections.
Thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me, Jenny. And I have nothing prepared because she literally asked me at coffee time this morning if I would be able to stand in. So I guess, as Jenny mentioned, I took on the role in Trinity of Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action about 6 months ago. I've spent 6 months trying to understand a university that I've worked in for 20 years. The thing that I've realised is this issue of tackling climate change and biodiversity loss penetrates into absolutely everything that we do as a university. And so we're trying to approach our action and our strategy by thinking about what the key things are that we do as a university. So, our main mission in research and education. I think in terms of research, as you mentioned, Jenny, we've done an awful lot as academics in terms of our research. In terms of our education, perhaps until recently, it's been quite niche and it's been very narrow and maybe a little bit siloed. And that's something we need to expand out on. And then in terms of our business and how we operate as a university and what we do and our buildings and our structures and our way of work and our travel and, all of that kind of stuff all needs looking at as well. So there's these three bins, I suppose, that I'm thinking about in terms of research, education and sort of operations or day-to-day function. But underpinning all of that is this idea of interaction. And as Jenny said, I'm an ecologist. That's what I study, is how organisms interact with each other and with the natural world. And I think we need to embrace that in the way that we tackle this issue, because it does involve everybody. It is about interaction. It is about everything that we do and the knock-on consequences that we can't maybe yet see. It's complicated, it's multifaceted, and it really does need systemic change. So collaboration, cooperation, partnership within and outside of the university, I think, are all going to be really key. So that's just some of my thoughts of the enormity of the task. And I suppose, we've got good roots, but we now need to build on that in the future.
Thanks for that, Jane. And I think it's a really nice segue to Dermot. So you've been heavily involved in this ALLEA report towards sustainability. So if maybe you could just speak to that and also general reflections.
Sure, and thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks to the Academy for the invitation. So yeah, the ALLEA working group on climate sustainability was met over the course of, I think it was probably 6 or 9 months. I was nominated by this Academy. And we worked. It was a really interesting group from across Europe. Across the career spectrum, from senior academics to early career researchers, a really interesting range of perspectives and a really positive experience of working together under an excellent the excellent stewardship of Professor Astrid Eichhorn, who chaired the working group. The report was launched at the ALLEA, I'm forgetting the name, their annual conference. General Assembly, thank you, Luke, earlier this year. It's available on the ALLEA website, and I would encourage you all to take a look at it. What we tried to do was think through the component stakeholders of the Academy and to try to map out what each of those stakeholders is currently doing, to try to gather baseline data, if you like, and also then to tease out some recommendations. So to list them very briefly, the categories were universities, research institutes, students, individual academics, funding organizations, conference organizers, academies and learned societies, ranking agency, and ranking agencies and policymakers. So there really is something in there for everyone. So wherever you sit in the universe, the ecosystem of academia, hopefully there's something in there for you. I won't and don't have time to go into detail on the recommendations, but I just wanted to call out a couple of cross-cutting themes that were central to our work. So the first was around translating knowledge into action. So we acknowledge in the report that we have it's true across society that we don't. It's not that we're not taking action because of a lack of knowledge, and that's particularly true within the academy. We pride ourselves on the generation of new knowledge and understanding, and so fundamentally we need to look at our own practices and turn that knowledge into action. We ask the question: is academia different or special or unique? And the question of exceptionalism pervades debates around climate action and action on biodiversity loss and other environmental challenges. And you won't hear a single sector anywhere in the world that doesn't make the claim that they are exceptional and that their activities, their practices are particularly, if not uniquely important. And we hear that those arguments made within the academy as well. And our answer to the question of whether that argument stands up to scrutiny is that no, academia needs to play its part as well. We also placed a strong emphasis on equity and particularly the distribution of access to, if you like, the benefits or the perks of academic life. So, if we take the example of flying, we know that flying is, contributes a lot to greenhouse gas emissions, and that academics fly a lot. But the distribution of the if you like, the right to fly or the ability to fly is very unequally distributed, and it's heavily weighted towards the top of the career spectrum. So that's a strong theme that came out in our report as well. Another theme was what social scientists would call structure and agency. So the recognizing the fact that as individual academics or working or universities, we see ourselves as agents within a structural context and faced with constraints set by funding organizations, policymakers, the overall governance system, and that places constraints on what we can do, but that we also, through our practices, we as academics, we create structures, for example, our students. So there are these relationships throughout the academic world of structure and agency. And then one final theme that we grappled with throughout our work is a tension between, on the one hand, the need for transformative action, and on the other hand, the need to start somewhere and to do something. And so in the recommendations in the report, we try to balance that with some calls for transformative action, but also a strong call that within the academy we need not to be paralyzed by the scale of the challenge, and we need to start and really get on with it. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the report, and I would encourage you all to have a look at it online, engage with it, and I'd be happy to pick up on some of those themes in the subsequent discussion.
Dermot, that's fabulous. You've given us a really wonderful overview, and what I pull from what you've just said is, how do we translate research into action? How do we get on with this? And I can see Jane and Karen furiously writing over there. So over to Jane and Karen. And maybe I'll start with Jane. In your role as VP in Trinity, how do you think you've been grappling with this? How do we transform all this incredible knowledge? We publish so many papers and we're beginning to think cross-disciplinary. We know what the problem is. We know the scale. We know what the solution is. How do we do it? How do we lead?
Yeah, and I think that the last comment that you made there, Dermot, in terms of being paralysed, this idea of we want to do everything right, and it's that phrase of don't let perfection be the enemy of the good or the success or whatever it is. And I think one of the things that is coming up repeatedly as an issue is around communication. So how we communicate that knowledge, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate what needs doing. You say we have a lot of knowledge, we have a lot of understanding of actions. It's communicating in order to prioritize those actions in terms of trying to communicate what we will do, what we won't do, in order that we can do these actions. Because of course we can't do everything. We can't just keep adding things on top. We don't want this to be a tick box exercise. It needs to be something that is systemic and real. So there's a lot of need for clarity in communications, and as scientists, I suppose scientists have known for decades that there's issues, and there was a paper published in 1992, which was a scientist's warning to humanity, and pointing out all the problems in the natural world. 25 years later, there's thousands more scientists got together and wrote a second warning to humanity. So scientists have been shouting about this for 30 years, and yet the action hasn't followed suit. And I think it's maybe scientists just aren't very good at communicating. I think that's possibly one of the things. The other thing is that it seems like an overwhelming challenge for any one individual or one organization or institution to tackle. And coming back to that shouldn't paralyze us. We shouldn't not start, because there's a lot to do, and there is a lot of evidence that just getting started and doing little things, and each individual being involved and making that first step is really the key. So it's giving people the agency to make those first steps, communicating what those first steps might be, and communicating with each other along the journey. And I think sometimes we think, gosh, we've done nothing, but actually when we look at it, we have done a lot. It's just there's a lot more to do.
Yeah, I wonder, Karen, you have experience with citizen science approaches, and I think it's really timely that this weekend in Malahide, the first Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss in the world will make their final deliberations, and they'll actually put forward a set of recommendations to government. Do you think that there is a role for that type of deliberative process within higher education, perhaps within individual, to get started within individual institutions, to try and kind of break this barrier that we currently have?
Yeah, I mean, the citizen science project I was involved in was very much a partnership approach right throughout the UK. So my partner was the Field Studies Council. They were very much about delivery on the ground, lots of different groups of people spending time outdoors, learning about nature. And then I was kind of the academic education side of the thing, and we worked, really well together. There were also people from in museums and other environmental educators informally and things like this, and people working with young people on probation in the justice system. So it was a huge, diversity of different groups of people involved in it. And yes, I do think that is a way forward. And coming from some of my earlier research around what is science and what young people think science is, I think citizen science is a great way to demystify science and to remove some of those conceptions that science is just for the clever people. Whereas, we had all different groups of children and young people outdoors observing and looking at their world and beginning to understand how interdependent we are. And unfortunately, that tends to have been taught in a very textbook way. I really can't understand how we can teach about our independence and our connection, to our friends, the plants, unless we're actually outside looking at them and spending time and thinking about our place, their place, and how we can mutually live on this planet, I guess. So the citizen science projects were a wonderful way to do that with children as young as 4, right the way through to those doing their A-levels, who, might be some of our future scientists and future botanists and all of that. And then people maybe for whom society has not served them particularly well, and having that, the benefit of that connection, that we can all take part in science. We all have a role to play, and therefore we all have a role to play in protecting science and protecting the environment as well. So there was massive reach with that. A project, I guess you could say, we had over 15,000 beneficiaries, and there was a big focus on disadvantaged areas, maybe where some of that communication is not. It's just not getting there, despite best efforts sometimes, I think. So 95% of the children that we worked with in Northern Ireland were from what we would deem disadvantaged communities. And, we would have had wonderful experiences with children saying, oh, so you can actually do science like this? Oh, right, I thought you just had to be in a lab and whatever. And I was like, yeah, scientists do all sorts of different things. So that education from very young was really important part of that project. And the Citizens Assembly, wonderful. I wouldn't be true to my own values if I didn't say we also need to have more young people and more youth assemblies. So I also was involved with a wonderful project, Grassroots Challenge project, and I had the privilege of speaking with young people aged about maybe 12, 13, right up to 24, in depth about what they think about this Wicked Challenge and what they think needs to be done and their understanding of it. And very loud and very clear, they're telling us that they have a part to play, that they want to make a difference for nature, that they understand we are interdependent, and that they believe in their capabilities to contribute. And it was all very positive, as opposed to let's blame the other generations for what's going on, now that we're going to have to tidy up, basically. So many of them felt really empowered as a result of taking part in a programme like that was simply designed to take young people outside, spend time in nature, understand it a little bit more, meet other young people with similar interests. And what struck me with that project is it was very cleverly designed to bring in young people, again, disadvantaged, but also our young farmers. So some people that would traditionally have very opposing views to what we need to do, and yet these young people they showed the way for older generations and how we can actually work together, and we can be very powerful in what we're going to do here, and we have a very clear idea about what we're going to do. And they did make a big call for education, which would match some of what's going on with, Teach the Future movements and things as well, which we're trying to get going as well in Northern Ireland. So that the teaching of sustainable development and the experience and the lived experiences of it is right the way through, and it's embedded in everything right up from preschool. And they were very clear that they understand that that's what needs to happen. They sadly still talked about some peer stigma around being a tree hugger, and that still is in existence. And many of them who obviously had fantastic people in their lives who taught them to be very critical about the things that they see in their world. We're talking about, so how can people have so many clicks and be so influential talking about the contouring of makeup? And we are destroying our planet. So why is the attention going there as young people? So they were actually critical of other young people as well as grown-ups, which I found really fascinating. So they made lovely recommendations, but we need to get right in there with those people that are influencing, those people of our age that are influencing. Why are they influencing? And yet people like us aren't. Despite screaming from the rafters, basically, is how they were feeling. So a fascinating study, and I can make that available as well for those that are interested to read about the voices from our young people. So
thank you, that's great. Yeah, we're not great as academics, as influencers, like makeup artists on Instagram, which is a terrible thing to say. YouTubers. So Dermot, I know you chaired the Youth Assembly on Biodiversity. Would you like to come in on that, on the importance of, reaching out beyond the higher education sector into right down to the, preschoolers? And
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Jenny neglected to mention that you're involved in the Adult Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity Loss as a member of the expert advisory group, and by all accounts doing wonderful work on that. So I and some colleagues from UCC and from Terre des Hommes, an international children's environmental rights NGO, were funded by Malcolm Noonan's department, the Department of Housing, to design and run a parallel children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss that would run alongside but separately from the Adult Citizens Assembly. And so we brought together 35 children and young people aged 7 to 17 together for 2 weekends of what I would loosely call deliberation. I think play and fun is probably another way to describe it. Our philosophy from the start was that everyone should go home at the end with a smile on their face, and it should be enjoyable. It should be a learning experience and an empowering experience, but also a fun experience. And I hope we did achieve that. So it was 2 weekends, one in Glencree Centre for Peace and Reconciliation and one in Killarney House and Gardens. Jane would have been there if COVID hadn't sadly intervened. But it was a wonderful experience, really, uplifting and empowering. We have some resources, a lovely video that captures the essence of it on the website. But in terms of the recommendations, I was really struck by a number of things, and I think they echo some of what Karen was saying from your experience. So one was the clarity of expression. The messages, the key messages, the vision, their calls to action come through really, really clearly, and they had lovely ways of expressing things. So, for example, one of their key messages was that we should treat the earth like a member of the family or a close friend, which is, I think a sentiment that adults would relate to and endorse, but it's not a way of expression that I think adults might naturally come up with. Another thing that really struck me was interconnection. So they were really good at seeing the connections between what we would think of as different sectors or different policy areas. They didn't think in boxes, and it taught me, I think, something important about what we teach out of children as they grow older, so I was really, really impressed by the work that they did and the recommendations that they came out with, and we brought 6 representatives from the Children and Young People's Assembly to the last meeting of the Adult Citizens Assembly 3 weeks ago, and they presented their calls to action in order to inform the deliberations of the adults. And as I said, there are some nice resources on including videos and a document with the calls to action on the project website, cyp-biodiversity.ie.
Thanks, Dermot. And so maybe just finally, because I do want to open it up to the audience, the importance of thinking from the higher education sector, our role in educating the next generation who aren't siloed, who aren't within discipline. We've all, I think, identified the importance of, it's such a complex problem. It takes a very unique interdisciplinary skill set that we currently don't educate students typically for. So maybe Jane, would you like to speak to that? And then it's briefly Dermot and Karen, but what can we do that will really, what does the next generation of graduates look like, and how do we get there? How do we educate them when it's actually quite difficult to do structurally within university?
Yeah, and I think it's getting that balance between interdisciplinarity and disciplinary expertise, which obviously we need, and it's getting that balance is tricky. But I think it's also not just them understanding each other's disciplines and being able to talk across disciplines. I think that's something that takes a long time and is very hard. But they need, the other skills, the soft skills. They need to be brave. They need to be adaptable. They need to be compassionate. They need to be honest, and we can get these skills into every program. So it's looking at that disciplinary knowledge and we're getting out of the idea of filling their heads with knowledge, and moving into that more being able to talk across disciplines and being able to understand each other's disciplines and those softer skills. Knowledge has never been more easily available. We don't need to fill their heads with knowledge. We need to help them to understand that knowledge and how to use it. But I think that these soft skills are going to be really important. And I think it is, it's also, as part of the university experience is to give them some real world experience and internships and work experience and getting them out of that mindset that comes from second level, which is that you learn about subjects in boxes and you pass an exam and tick, it's done. So I think we do have a responsibility to our graduates that they graduate with knowledge of the climate and biodiversity crises, and that there are solutions, and that it doesn't become hopeless, and that there is a sense of we can tackle this, and that it's not the end of the line.
And Karen, maybe briefly your thoughts, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of what Jane said there as well. And I think just what's been resonating with me working with my student teachers at the minute is that we emphasise that we're preparing young people for jobs that don't exist yet. There's a lot of chat about green jobs, but I think every job's going to have to be a green job. At the minute, there are adverts for jobs such as social media content manager. Whoever thought that would be what we would consider to be a job, a job. So I think that that's where we need to start, and it needs to be all-encompassing. And the roots are there, and they're grassroots. So there's several academics and non-academic staff at the minute forming their own sustainability groups to ensure that sustainability is embedded across all programs, regardless of what you're teaching, really. So that bottom-up approach is starting. It's gaining momentum. It's getting stronger. Universities can be very urgent when they need to be. For example, in the UK, they can be very urgent about the research exercise. They can be very urgent about increasing how many millions of funding. We have highly skilled people, very talented people, but I think it's just about turning the heads away from the other things that we think we need to be urgent about. A rake of funding in a bank account's not going to be very much use when, we're destroying our planet. And just one final comment around the hopelessness. Our young people are very responsive and very understanding of concerns around ecological grief and ecological anxiety. But I feel that it is paralysing some people within education around discussing this and bringing it out into the open, because we're more fearful of making our young people anxious about it. So I think the message needs to be that it's not hopeless, and that's hopefully the message I'm going to send our future teachers out with. It's not hopeless. Everybody can do something. So
that's great. Dermot.
Thanks. Yeah, just to come in on one point about interdisciplinarity in teaching. A speaker earlier in the day talked about the progression towards ever more specialised degree programs over recent decades, and I would agree with the need to make our teaching across different areas more interdisciplinary. One example of what we're doing in that regard in DCU is a new degree under the Human Capital Initiative that we've just launched. We're just coming to the end of the first semester of teaching on it, and it's our BSc in Global Challenges. And so it is a module program co-delivered by my school, which is Law and Government in Social Sciences, and our School of Electronic Engineering. And every module is co-taught by one lecturer from Law and Government and one lecturer from Electronic Engineering. And to be honest, I think I think the students slot quite easily into it. I think it's much more of a challenge for us on the lecture, on the academic side, than it is for the students. I think they're quite comfortable with the idea of bringing together perspectives on technology and society. It's us that are struggling, and it's even, it's down to things like assessment and different cultures of teaching and assessment across different disciplines. I think our students are well ahead of us in this regard, and we need to catch up with them.
Yes, I agree. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. Any questions or any points that the audience would like to add to this discussion?
Hi there, good afternoon. Thank you so much for such fascinating inputs this afternoon. My name is Siobhan Sleeman. I'm from the Department of Further and Higher Education and Research. I just wanted to ask the panel for any observations you might have. We've heard a lot, I think, today about values, also about structures, as you mentioned there in this panel. And also about things like quality of leadership and so on across the various sessions today. So I'm just wondering your own perspectives on how, I suppose, to really bring it up the radar or up the kind of priority list, as you said, within our institutions to really embed this in our kind of leadership and governance structures. Great to hear from you, Karen, that you're saying there is that kind of grassroots movement across academics to really work on this collaboratively. But just, any observations or thoughts you might have on how to really get it higher up the priority list. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're absolutely right. It does need embracing by the senior leadership team in the university, and I find myself in a very lucky position in Trinity at the moment because our provost is absolutely living and breathing this, and I think that signal ripples down, and I think then it becomes easier to make change. It becomes easier to get people on board, and it's not seen as something niche. And I think that's really key, is that it can't be seen as, okay, we have a position and an office that's dealing with this over here, grand, we're all sorted. That's that. It really needs to be systemic. It needs to be central, and it needs to be supported from the high-level leadership. So we've got that support in Trinity. So we'll see how we get on.
Would anyone else like to?
Yeah, maybe just to add, coming back to what I was saying about kind of, I guess the structure agency relationship being replicated at different levels. So as an academic in a university, I see my university structure and the leadership providing that structure within which I'm an agent. But I know that my senior leadership in turn see the HEA and the department and the broader governance system as the structure within which they operate. So I think leadership coming from multiple sources, including and something like the letter that came to university presidents from the department via the HEA in relation to the carbon budgets and the sectoral emission ceilings. That's just one example, but we all respond to incentives and so I think the messages coming from multiple points is including from government is important.
And maybe I will just add that we didn't get a chance on the panel to discuss the actual practicalities of the universities leading in terms of getting their whole campus to half carbon, then zero carbon, and some of the barriers. But that is an area where I suppose incentivization and budgets would help, because there's currently big barriers and they're mainly financial, because I think the will is there and the knowledge is there.
wonder if there's a generational aspect about this leadership. And the reason I say that is you said your provost is absolutely on board, and I find I'm a Deputy Vice-Chancellor Provost, and I lead on sustainability, and I find that that's the case. But I'm not absolutely convinced that the presidents of universities are quite in the same place across, say, the UK higher education sector. And I just wonder whether that is a generational thing, whether that is something that we need to address, because I do see that as a potential barrier to that real, complete setting of the agenda at the very highest level, and then being able to influence beyond the universities into the funding councils. For example, I'm going to a meeting of the with UKRI on Tuesday next week, organised by University of Scotland and so on, to try and influence the funding councils. But I feel that the collective leadership of university presidents is not quite as strong as it might be from my experience, and I wonder whether you share that experience.
I think this would be one for Jane, is it?
I'm not sure if I know the answer to that question. It could be a generational thing. I think it's also a societal thing, and you know, it comes back to this, you know, where does the leadership come from? I mean, the environment, the natural history, understanding the natural world has really not been high on anyone's agenda. It's been marginalized in government, it's been marginalized in society, it's been marginalized in our economic system and our businesses. So, but it's coming in. And so I think that it might not be so much a generational thing as a I feel momentum, whole of society momentum. I feel it's going to come from the private sector and push the government. I feel that then that will, you know, that will hopefully push some of this leadership. But it's almost like everybody needs to get on board with it. And I feel like it's coming. I mean, Jenny, you mentioned in the introduction there, you know, everybody's aware of Climate COP. COP27's just happened. Everyone's aware of that. Very few people are aware that in 2 weeks' time, the biodiversity COP will begin. But that nobody knew about that 2 years ago. So I feel like the momentum is getting there. There's a few more people know about it. Maybe at the end of this year with the certainly here, you know, with the biodiversity COP, with the Citizens Assembly on Biodiversity, with the joint Oireachtas report that just came out, with the National Biodiversity Action Plan at the beginning of next year, it's coming from every direction, and I think that might help to shift things.
Karen and Dermot, do you want to address that as well?
Yeah. So, like Jane, I'm not sure. I suspect there are individual personal characteristics, you know, that shape how each of us think about these challenges. Certainly at a general level, we hear about younger employees coming into organizations that senior management or, you know, people sitting on interview panels, they hear anecdotally all the time that new recruits are asking what their organizations across different sectors are doing on sustainability. So I think there's probably a broader phenomenon there. One other remark would be just, you know, in defense of senior management, they have really difficult jobs to do and are faced with a whole set of very challenging constraints. You know, it's not that, I think in most cases, it's not that if they are not putting climate and biodiversity to the fore, it's not necessarily because they don't care, it's because there are all these other constraints that they're having to deal with as well.
No excuses.
Dermot, I just wanted to thank you for your kind words about the ALLEA report, but I have to point out that it was a joint project with the German Young Academy. And actually, I think, touching on the generational issue, one thing that's very clear is that the enthusiasm and dedication actually of the young academies in this area is really going to make a difference. I mean, it was supported by the board, but the real impetus came from the Astrid and the Young Academy. And it has had an effect, actually. I mean, I noticed that a significant number of our board members are now traveling by train. And we are actually just debating switching our catering to vegetarian whenever possible. So, I mean, these are small things, but it is important because it shows you take it seriously. I mean, let's not pretend that changing academia will solve the climate problem. It won't, but it gives our advocacy credibility. And that's the important point.
We have one more question. Maybe not. So, well, I think on that really, is there one more at the back? Yeah.
Thanks. I was just thinking of what Karen and Dermot were saying about the youth assemblies, and I know after a decade in an English university that students were actually the leaders in terms of changing universities. There was an impact award system, kind of like the sustainability equivalent of the Athena Swan, but without the power. You know, there was no funding implications or anything. But I think, you know, thinking about structures and agency involving students in that leadership and in projects and initiatives and the associations of students' unions and things can be really, really powerful in terms of changing our universities. They're transient members of our communities, but they're really, really enthusiastic and energetic. And you know, going back to the generational thing, they're very clear about what they want, and they can be real impetus for change, and they can really act on it as well in very powerful ways. So I think we need to bring them into that conversation a bit more actively as well.
I think that's a wonderful positive note to end on, you know, the power of the younger generations in pushing change. So I would like to thank the audience for being with us all afternoon, and a special thanks to the panelists, Jane, Karen and Dermot. Thank you so much for your contributions, and to the Royal Irish Academy for hosting us today.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent discussion. And just to give some reassurance about the old Academy, the President and Council of the Royal Irish Academy are very committed to sustainability, and indeed the President appointed Vice President with particular emphasis on this subject. So we're committed very much to this particular agenda. So we've had a wonderful day to now, and excellent presentations, and our Secretary for Polite Literature and Antiquities, Dan Carey, has agreed to provide some feedback. Dan.
Thank you very much. I won't keep people too long because we've had a day where we've covered so much, but I did want to make a few points in closing, and also provocations, things that we didn't touch on, things that we could say more about, and things that I learned in the process. I'm going to start by also thanking Jerry and the Academy generally for convening this day, and I hope it's one that we can have in the future and carry forward as a durable conversation. There are a few things about the present environment that are significant. Obviously, the HEA bill, which has now been adopted and is now the law of the land governing much of what we do going forward. We have the prospect of a new research agency amalgamating SFI and IRC. The HEA has just turned 50. There was an event this week marking that occasion. And we have a new research policy and strategy with Impact 2030. So there's a lot going on in this space. Other things that we didn't particularly touch on today, but I think are really significant, are massive demographic change in Ireland. The full census report will come out, I think, in April. We've had a preliminary report, but I think that's something that's going to take us a while to assimilate. Ireland is changing rapidly. It has implications for EDI, for lots of the things that we're doing, and the look of these institutions and our relationship to society going forward. That's something that we need to reflect on. In relation to academic freedom, I just wanted to make a few points. One is, how many universities in their statements of strategy reference academic freedom? I know of one, at least, the one that I work in, that doesn't. Of course, it's a value that we take for granted. We cannot take it for granted. And I think some of the recent work that's been going on in the Academy that Luke is associated with at ALLEA demonstrates that. We have to renew our commitment to this. And there are many forms in which it can be intruded on. Some of them are graphic, violent, and destructive, and others are more pernicious, more subtle. But we have to liberate ourselves and to think seriously about it. And I think, to pick up on Linda Hogan's point, this is a social good. This isn't just a privilege that we somehow arrogate to ourselves. This is a good that we all benefit from and have to commit ourselves to. I was thinking of another phrase, partly provoked by Linda's comment too, of what we might call sinecure science. We know citizen science, sinecure science. I think we have to battle a certain kind of populist impulse that the Academy is this removed, effete, privileged entity which speaks from a position of authority that it arrogates to itself. That's always a risk. So we have to recommit ourselves to a social and a public mission, which is, I think, part of our ethos, but we also have other forces that we're not entirely controlling in control of that can work against that. And if there's change of government in Ireland, we don't know entirely what direction that might go in. In terms of the value of research, I wanted to make an observation, and this is what I would call Putin's history lesson. We have been encouraged to think of history as a kind of heritage science. I think Putin has refuted that. It is much more. It's also a reminder that we are never in a position to know what it is we are going to need to know. We found out suddenly that people who have an understanding of Ukraine and Eastern Europe and of these deep relationships, and Professor Melloni is a wonderful example of this, is so compelling. And if you just look at somebody's title on a CV, you will not understand the riches of the resources that they can bring to this equation. It's a further endorsement of the importance and the value of the humanities too. Just thinking about, higher education in general, we didn't speak so much, I think it was implicit in what we talked about the universities as places in which there is the formation of the self. On the other hand, we have universities as sources of micro-credentials. We're pulling in very different directions. I think we've got to think about multiple commitments that we have, but not to lose sight of this higher vocation, if I can appeal to it. In terms of career progression and precarity, we touched on that. It came from the floor. I think the Young Academy and that initiative is going to be very important in this space. But one of the things that we haven't had in Ireland for all of the investment in higher education is really an investment in new staff. So we've got people who are stranded in career terms, and that is perverse. It's not in our interest. It's very damaging to those who have made a commitment to higher education, to research, to the value of teaching, and all the things that we do and care about. So I would really urge some thinking about that in the midst of other areas in which we need funding for research and so forth. We didn't talk really very much about the TU sector as its own domain. It's very much part of Impact 2030. I'm interested myself in how ambitious that research agenda is going to be and the investment that we need in order to make it happen. What is the real vision in that context? I think that's still to be determined and decided, and I hope it will be a powerful one. The thing that I hope we will avoid is one in which the UK has gone down the creation of the Russell Group and all of the implications of that. We shouldn't sleepwalk into that kind of scenario. We talked a lot about impact. That was even at the beginning of our discussions and throughout the day. And MRIA Lepton, I think, spoke wonderfully on that and inspiringly on it, and Professor Bologna's contribution about fertility, even if that was a noble cause that had to be set aside. We talked about research assessment as well. I'm not sure that we've really made that much progress in really cracking how we're going to do it. And certainly in an Irish context, I know from my own experience, and I think this will be widely shared, we are still under the shadow of the REF model. And we know that that's no longer suitable, if I can put it that way, but we haven't really thought about what exists on the other side of the moon. That's a collective challenge. It's obviously a European and a wider challenge there at the same time. That brings us, to that vexed question of Brexit, which we didn't formally discuss. It was implicit in so much of our conversation. But I just want to throw out a question, which I'd love to know the answer. How many people working in HEIs in Ireland did their advanced degrees or any of their degrees in the UK? I imagine it's look at the hands that have gone up. My hand can go up as well. This is an extraordinary resource. We need to understand it, to grasp it. This is not going to disappear. It's a responsibility that we have collectively. So I think we need to think about that and be serious about it. Just a quick thought on missions and grand challenges. I was really intrigued by the reference to the DCU program in the last discussion there. That sounds fascinating. On the one hand, we have, and this is in Impact 2030, there are really two challenges that are mentioned, climate change and digital transition. Often grand challenges are just treated as they're known. We know what they are. They're probably the SDGs. We could probably do a little bit more work to define them. But I would urge a little bit of caution about missions, only in the sense that I think sometimes there's a kind of, we know what they are, and then we turn away from them, but we also implicitly script their outcomes, and we often treat the humanities and social sciences as passengers in this. And I would only mention the great Marianne Mazzucato, who's such an influential figure in this context, with the moon mission as the wonderful instance that she gives. And I would only say this, in all of the discussion of the results and the fruitfulness of the moon mission and so on and so forth, there's never a reflection on the impact on the imagination of space travel. And can you think about the 1960s without that? I don't think so. And finally, to close on the question of the North-South dimension, was such a recurrent theme and such an important and a necessary one. This is an imperative, and we need to nurture it. That was such an interesting point that Michael Darcy made. It's not a given. It's something that we have to commit ourselves to. It's not always organic. We're always dealing with the implications of the border, and those we can never ignore them. They become ever more pressing and a greater source of concern. But that's something I think that the Academy can particularly encourage and foster because of its historic and ongoing commitment to that question. But we have to think about it in terms of research students, student mobility, in terms of opportunities, and indeed collective responsibilities. We won't see the catalysts of Scottish independence, apparently, as that's been taken off the agenda. There are other ways in which the future may define itself independently of that. Those are just some quick thoughts, but again, to thank Jerry and colleagues in the Academy for making today possible. So thank you very much.
And just a final couple of remarks to thank the staff in the Academy for all the work they've done in making this possible, and particularly Roisin Smith, but also Sinéad Reardon and Jennifer Keneally in policy and international relations, who've worked to put all this together and organize this. And I think it was a wonderful example of why national academies exist and the importance of them as providing a forum for the types of discussion that we had today, and long may they continue. Thank you all for coming. I think the President wants to say something.
So, one last comment. Late Friday afternoon, and it's terrific. There are still so many people in the room. When the pandemic struck, we, Jerry, Dan and I, all took up our relative positions on March the 16th, 2020. And from the start, it was obvious, I think to us, that doing something like this was a particular strength of the Academy, and that we could do it from home, through Zoom, and I would be remiss if I just let this meeting end today, and I hope it's part of an further discussion, without saying that without Jerry, this would not have happened. And without Dan, who curated an enormous number of webinars to keep the Academy, if you like, alive during the pandemic, we would not be here today. and having had such a really vibrant discussion. So I just want to say that these people, all of us, we do this in our own time, and this is the value of a learned academy. So I want to thank you all. We've had a great day. Thank you, Professor Melloni. I see you're still with us for such an inspiring talk. And I will be going up to look now for the University of Fez, founded by a lady in the 8th century or 859. So I'm going off to do that research tonight. So thank you all very much and have a good weekend. And thanks to the Academy.